Hello, welcome to Sleep History. Today I take you to the foggy and bone-chilling winter of New York in 1920. The Manhattan of that era looked nothing like the orderly business district of sterile glass towers we see today. On the streets, the rattling engines of Ford Model T automobiles roared on one side, while the clatter of hooves and the neighing of horse-drawn carriages echoed on the other. The city had found a strange harmony between the sharp smell of coal smoke and the silence brought by freshly fallen snow. In 1920, New York resembled a giant construction site. Because the island had reached its horizontal limits, growth was now rising upward. Each year more skyscrapers climbed into the sky, and narrow streets turned into harsh wind corridors trapped between tall buildings. Underground, subway lines worked like the arteries of the modern age, constantly feeding the city. Yet this rapid and uncontrolled rise made the winter wind even more merciless. The air blowing between buildings felt as if it doubled in strength. The winters of those years were far harsher than today. Insulation was weak and heating was expensive. People wrapped themselves in thick layers of wool to protect against the cold. In this story, you will experience together the methods a New Yorker used to survive the winter. But first, I have a small request. If you enjoy these journeys through history, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Your like and support truly mean a lot to me. Also, I would love it if you wrote in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there. Knowing from which corner of the world you join this journey would be wonderful. Now dim the lights, find a comfortable position and take a deep breath. If you are ready, let us begin. 5 in the morning. The harshest and most honest hour of a New York winter. When you open your eyes in an apartment in Manhattan in the 1920s, the first thing you feel is not silence but the sharp cold that stings the tip of your nose. Central heating existed in some buildings, but insulation was far behind today's standards. The delicate frost patterns forming on the inside of the window reminded you that only a thin sheet of glass separated you from the outside world. Getting out of bed was not just a simple movement. It was a small act of courage. People of that era did not sleep in thin pajamas. They slept in layered wool garments. Socks, thick nightgowns, sometimes even a soft cap pulled over the head. The morning cold was never underestimated. The cast iron radiator in the corner of the room made grumbling sounds as it waited for hot water from the large boiler in the basement. The metallic knocks coming from inside the pipes felt as if someone was struggling to break free within them. In reality, it was an ordinary physical reaction caused by steam condensing when it met the cold metal surface. But in the darkness of early morning, it sounded like a small battle. The janitor was already awake. In the basement, the lid of the coal furnace was opened and the metallic scrape of coal thrown in with a shovel echoed through the building. This sound was like the morning anthem of the apartment. If the coal was plentiful. If coal is added, the rooms slowly begin to warm up. If saved, one must rely a bit more on wool layers. 1920 was an important threshold for America. The census conducted that year showed for the first time in history that the urban population exceeded the rural population. This was a sign that cities like New York had now become giant human machines. Thousands of homes were trying to heat up at the same time. The smoke coming from the chimneys created a permanent layer of haze over the city. The morning sky would not appear clear blue. It appeared in tones of sooty orange and gray. The dream of a hot shower was not very realistic. Water heating systems in most buildings were considered primitive. In the early hours of the morning, the water flowing from the tap would be almost ice cold. Many people settled for washing their face in a small basin filled with water kept at room temperature overnight. Modern bathrooms were not in every apartment, especially in the tenement-type apartments of the Lower East Side. The shared toilet was in the hallway. Opening the door and stepping into the hallway in the morning cold was the most patience-requiring part of the daily routine. When you moved to the kitchen, you would see glass bottles in front of the door. The milkman had arrived by horse-drawn carriage toward morning and left the bottles silently that if the night had been harsh enough, the water in the milk would freeze and expand that it would push the cream layer upward. Sometimes a small ice protrusion would form at the mouth of the bottle that a silent proof of how cold the night was. And the city would slowly begin to wake up. That thin cardboard lid on the bottle would be pushed upward. Sometimes the milk would freeze and rise from the mouth of the bottle like a small pillar of ice. For a New Yorker of the 1920s, this sight was a natural thermometer showing how harsh the day would be. Thawing the frozen milk and mixing it into coffee was considered the first small engineering problem of the morning. When you looked out the window, you would see the street lights beginning to go out one by one. That these were not today's bright LED lights. They were yellowish, slightly flickering gas lamps or the first electric bulbs that were just becoming widespread. Snow removal vehicles were not yet developed. Therefore, the snow on the streets mostly turned into a hard layer of ice by being crushed. That sharp sound of horseshoes sliding on the ice was the most distinct echo of the morning. Horses were still important in the city's transportation, and winter was truly cruel for them. In the 1920s, waking up at 5 in the morning was like starting a struggle between nature and technology. The radiators, coal stoves, and lamps inside the house were symbols of the modern world. But they were not yet considered fully domesticated. Keeping them running required effort. Living with them required patience. Still, people of the period saw these difficulties as the price of progress. After all, they were living in one of the fastest growing and brightest cities in the world. The cold was just an obstacle to be overcome. The main goal was to survive and perhaps seize opportunities to prosper. Now you are heading toward your wardrobe. In the 1920s, dressing did not just mean looking stylish. It was also a defense strategy. In an era without thermal fabrics, wool was the greatest ally. When you stand in front of your closet, you need to forget about lightweight technical garments. In those years, dressing for winter was almost like putting on armor. Layers were your only line of defense against the sharp wind outside. There were no synthetic fabrics. Life was built on wool, cotton, and thick leather. Elegance was important, but not freezing was the priority. The first layer would be full-length wool underwear. A one-piece jumpsuit stretching from ankles to wrists. Its most famous feature was the button flap at the back. A practical detail designed to avoid removing the entire garment for the toilet. The slight itch left by the wool touching the skin would stay with you all day. The New York winter was not considered very merciful for sensitive skin. A cotton shirt goes over the underwear. However, most shirts in the 1920s were collarless. White collars were sold separately and attached to the shirt with small metal studs. The reason for this was that doing laundry was laborious. It was more practical to change only the soiled collar instead of washing the whole shirt. These collars were so starched that they were almost as stiff as cardboard. One had to be careful when turning the neck so it wouldn't be uncomfortable. The term white collar was born from the office workers who wore these pristine, stiff collars. When it was the turn for trousers and vests, the weight of the wool was felt more prominently. Trousers would be high-waisted and carried with suspenders instead of belts. Fabrics were thick and dense, stiff enough to almost stand on their own. This heavy weave was quite successful at cutting the wind. It was essential to button the vest before putting on the jacket. The vest was not just an elegant detail but an important layer that kept the torso warm. For women, the balance was more delicate. The 1920s were years when shorter skirts and straight cuts rose. However, those light fringe dresses were not enough on their own in the New York winter. Therefore, thick wool stockings were worn under the dresses. Silk stockings were considered a stylish luxury, but wool was always the practical choice against the harsh wind. Cold was a much more powerful decision maker than fashion. And so, prepared layer by layer, you would head toward the door. The city waiting for you outside was cold, noisy, and ruthless. But at the same time, it was full of opportunities. Every morning in 1920s New York began with a small struggle against both nature and time. In this freezing weather, wearing silk was almost synonymous with wearing nothing at all. That is why fabrics like artificial silk, namely rayon, started to become increasingly popular in those years. It was both more durable and more resistant to the cold. But the last and most important step before going out was putting that heavy overcoat on your back. Men's overcoats, usually extended below the knee, were made of thick wool, and sometimes weighed 5 to 6 kilograms. You would feel its weight the moment it sat on your shoulders. Real fur on the collars was not just the privilege of the wealthy, it was a natural way for the middle class to protect themselves from the cold. When you put on that coat, it wouldn't be surprising if you felt like you were going to a front rather than a city. The weight was not a burden but a feeling of security. The choice of shoes was a strategy in itself. One must remember that the streets were not cleaned regularly like today. Snow, mud, and horse remains would mix. Therefore, rubber protectors were put over the shoes. It had become a fashion trend for young girls to wear these rubber boots without fully fastening the buckles, making a jingle as they walked. It is said that one of the origins of the word flapper comes from these jingling steps. Finally, hat and gloves. In 1920s New York, it was considered almost inappropriate for a man to go out without a hat. Thick wool hats protected the head. The wool lining inside leather gloves saved fingers from freezing. Women preferred hats that completely wrapped around the head. These models covering the ears were quite functional for winter. This entire dressing process would take about 20 minutes. When you looked in the mirror, it was possible to see yourself more as a layered cabbage than a human. But when you opened the door and the sharp Manhattan wind hit your face, you understood the value of every layer. Now it is time to carefully descend the frozen steps. The moment you turn the heavy iron handle of the apartment door and step onto the street, the winter reality of 1920s New York greets you. This is not just cold. It is a mixture of coal smoke, freshly fallen snow, and the smell of horses felt in every corner of the city. On the sidewalk, there is a hard layer of ice a few centimeters thick that has turned gray. In those years, the municipality's snow removal teams did not have modern salting vehicles. Ashes from coal stoves were usually sprinkled on the ice. These ashes reduced slipping, but they soon turned the whiteness of the snow into a dirty brown. The city was in a complete period of transition. On one side, the explosive exhaust sounds of Ford Model T cars. On the other side, the noise of horse-drawn carriages that had not changed for centuries. When you stood in the middle of the street and looked around, you would feel that you were right in the middle of a great logistical transformation. In the 1920s, horses were still carrying the burden of New York. However, their contribution was not limited to carrying power. It is known that in the early 1900s, about 1,000 tons of horse manure accumulated on city streets daily. By 1920, cars had largely reduced this problem. Still, it was possible to come across horse remains at every corner on the frozen streets. In winter, it would snow and cover them. When spring came, the melting ice would leave unpleasant surprises. Unlike modern humans who complain about exhaust fumes today, the person of 1920 found comfort in the fact that at least it didn't smell bad. Cars were not yet reliable machines. If you owned a Ford Model T, starting the vehicle on a cold morning required serious effort. You had to turn the crank handle in the front repeatedly. If you were lucky, the engine would start with a cough. If you were unlucky, the handle would kick back and could injure your wrist. Therefore, many drivers of that period would have their wrists bandaged. Traffic on the street did not have regular lanes and perfect lights like today. Noise, steam, and cold would mix together. Dense clouds of steam from the horse's breath rose in the morning air. They intertwined with the smoke from the engines. And you, inside all this chaos with your layered wool armor, would begin to walk into the winter of 1920s New York. Wearing silk in freezing weather was almost synonymous with walking around naked. That is why artificial silk fabrics began to spread rapidly in those years. The final step before leaving the house was those massive overcoats. That men's coats often descended below the knee and consisted of heavy wool layers reaching 5 to 6 kilograms. The real fur on their collars was not unique to the wealthy. The middle class also resorted to this method to protect themselves from the cold. The weight settling on your shoulders when you put that coat on gave a strange sense of security. As if you were going to a small war rather than your daily chores. Choosing shoes was a strategy in itself, because the roads were not clean like today. Mud, snow, and horse manure would mix together. Therefore, rubber protectors were put over the shoes. In the 1920s, it was a fashion trend for young girls to wear these boots without intentionally fastening the buckles so they would jingle while walking. There are even those who say the origin of the word flapper comes from this sound. Going out without a hat and gloves was unthinkable. In 1920s New York, a man going out without a hat was considered almost as strange as going out without trousers. Thick wool hats protected the head. Leather gloves with wool linings saved fingers from freezing. Women preferred hats that completely wrapped around the ears. The dressing process would take an average of 20 minutes. When looking in the mirror, one could see themselves as a layered cabbage. But when you opened the door and that sharp Manhattan wind hit your face, you would be grateful for every layer. When you descend the stairs and step onto the street, not only the cold but the strange winter landscape of the era greets you. The steam rising from the horse's breath, the never-ending city noise. The moment you turn the iron door handle and go outside, 1920s New York hits your face like a hard slap. This is not just low temperature. It is a mixture of coal smoke, fresh snow, and the smell of horses permeated everywhere. The sidewalks are covered with gray ice a few centimeters thick. At that time, the municipality did not have modern salting vehicles. Stove ashes were mostly sprinkled on the snow. These ashes reduced slipping but quickly turned the city's pure white appearance into a dirty brown. The city was in a complete period of transition. On one side, the popping exhaust sounds of Ford Model Ts. On the other side, horse-drawn carriages that had not changed for centuries. It is known that in the early 1900s about 1,000 tons of horse manure accumulated on the streets daily. By 1920, automobiles had reduced this burden. But traces could still be found in frozen corners in winter. When spring arrived, unpleasant surprises would emerge. Exhaust smoke was bad perhaps, but many thought at least it didn't smell. Automobiles were not perfect either. Starting a Ford Model T in cold weather was almost a morning exercise. One had to turn the handle in the front 4 minutes. If you were lucky, the engine would start with a cough. If not, the handle could kick back and injure your wrist. Traffic did not flow regularly like today. The first traffic lights were just being installed on Fifth Avenue in 1920. Before that, intersections were left to the hand signals of police and the shouts of drivers. Manhattan's vertical architecture turned the wind into a storm. The streets intersecting perpendicularly worked like giant wind tunnels. Especially the Woolworth Building was the tallest in the world in those years. Building and was called the Cathedral of Commerce. People had to hold their hats with their hands while looking at this giant structure to keep them from blowing away. The sound of the streets was more metallic than today's, the sound of hooves hitting stones, the shrill friction of trams on the rails, the muffled screams of air horns. The cleaning workers, called white wings, carried giant brushes in their hands with their snow-white uniforms. They were at the front lines of the war that civilization waged against coal dust and horse manure. Their work became twice as hard in winter. Removing frozen dirt was only possible with muscle power. While a banker wrapped in furs got into his chauffeur-driven car on the same sidewalk, a boy selling newspapers with thin shoes could stand a few meters away. There was no television and the internet was not even a dream. Radio had not yet reached every home. You had to hand that boy 5 cents to get news. 1920 was also the year women gained the right to vote. This new sense of freedom was reflected in the streets. Their walks, their gazes, and their clothes were changing. They were no longer just wives sitting at home but individuals with a say in the city's future. When you approached Broadway, the lighted billboards of the theaters were dazzling. Electricity was surrounding the city, but it was still expensive. Those lights represented not only wealth but also faith in technology. Walking slowly in New York was almost forbidden. Steps would quicken as the cold intensified. You could come across a vendor selling chestnuts over a coal fire on a corner. Hot chestnuts were both a snack and a small handheld heat source. When you put a paper bag in your coat pocket, the heat would spread to the wool layers and you would forget the wind for a few minutes. Now it is time to get away from these smoky streets and look for breakfast. Because the morning cold of 1920s New York did not just make you cold, it made you terribly hungry. Moreover, the heavy farmer breakfasts of the 19th century had begun to leave their place to lighter and faster options suitable for the pace of the modern world. While lighter and faster breakfast options became widespread, some extraordinary names appeared on the scene. One of them was John Harvey Kellogg. Cornflakes became an indispensable part of city life thanks to his and his competitors' marketing intelligence. Interestingly, these flakes were initially designed to keep people calmer and controlled, rather than to create a flavor explosion. But the New Yorker of the 1920s transformed this tasteless product in their own way, by sprinkling plenty of sugar on it. Thus, a plain health food claimed to be scientific evolved into an energy-filled morning ritual. The colorful cardboard boxes on the kitchen table were now symbols of modernity. Another innovation that entered breakfast during the same period was orange juice. This habit, which seems ordinary today, was the result of giant advertising campaigns conducted in those years. Orange producers had spread the idea of an orange every day to get rid of their surplus. As the concept of vitamins was just becoming popular, people began to believe that squeezing citrus in the morning was the key to health. A glass of orange juice on your table was not just a drink. It was the joint victory of modern medicine and advertising. And what about bacon and eggs? Edward Bernays had a share in the rise of this duo as well. Bernays, one of the pioneers of public relations, asked thousands of doctors the question, is a heavy breakfast healthy? In order to increase bacon sales, he published the positive answers he received in newspapers with big headlines. As a result, millions of people started throwing bacon into the pan every morning under the influence of this campaign, which they thought was medical advice. The New York kitchen of the 1920s was actually a silent laboratory of marketing strategies. If there was no time at home, the solution was on the street. One of the city's most striking innovations was the automat restaurants operated by Horn and Hardart. Pies, sandwiches, and cakes were lined up behind glass-lidded compartments stretching along the wall. You would drop 5 cents, turn the metal handle, and take your food. Hundreds of thousands of people benefited from this system every day. Although it was promoted as technology prepared without being touched by hands, there were workers constantly working behind the glass. The showcase of modernity was skillfully covering up the labor. The most popular drink of the automats was coffee. That dark liquid flowing from the tap was almost a fuel for New Yorkers. The 1920s were years when coffee culture changed rapidly. Percolators were used in homes and coffee was prepared by boiling. The resulting intense and slightly burnt smell was an inseparable part of winter mornings. Adding plenty of sugar and cream to coffee was not considered a luxury. This was a precaution taken against the cold. The transformation in the kitchen was not limited to food alone. The first electric toasters had hit the market. They were not automatic yet. When one side of the bread was toasted, you had to open the lid and turn it. A moment of distraction could fill the kitchen with smoke in a few seconds. Still, these devices meant great freedom for those who had to wait at the stove for hours. As technology entered the kitchen, the heavy rhythm of the mornings was accelerating. When breakfast was over, a mixed taste would remain: sugary cereal, salty bacon, strong coffee. This taste symbolized the energy needed for the rest of the day. Now it was time to leave the house. To catch the subway or to walk with quick steps toward the office buildings rising with steel and concrete. You were becoming a part of a new era without realizing it. As one of the first true members of that modern consumer society shaped by advertising, technology, and speed, you weren't even aware. Because the city had already set its pace. New York City waited for you, and this city did not like those who took it slow. If you were a white-collar worker in the 1920s, your way to work would likely pass through the magnificent lobby of a skyscraper that was newly completed or still rising. These lobbies were not ordinary entrances. They were designed like the temples of modern commerce. Marble walls, where Art Deco and Gothic lines merged, soaring ceilings and brass ornaments would remind a person that they were a small but important gear. But right behind the splendor, the technological test of the period awaited: elevators. There was no pushing a button and waiting like today. A uniformed operator stood at the head of every cabin. It was his duty to stop the cabin exactly at the floor level by skillfully turning the metal handle. A deviation of a few centimeters could turn into a small but embarrassing stumble experienced every morning. When you stepped into the office, not silence but a factory-like hum would greet you. Wooden desks lined up side by side in large halls, endless piles of documents. The open office layout already existed, but it was much noisier than today's. The heart of the 1920s was the typewriter. Heavy metal. The clatter of keys would turn into an almost rhythmic storm when hundreds of people typed at the same time. The sharp ring of black rotary phones would also mix in. Talking on the phone was still a formal act. Sentences were chosen carefully and the tone of voice was controlled. Documents circulated with surprising speed. Papers were sent from unit to unit thanks to pneumatic tube systems installed on the office walls. The document placed in a small cylinder was put into the pipe and reached another floor within seconds. This system was so widespread that there were kilometers of pipelines under the city. Even some large post offices used this method for inter-neighborhood delivery. A physical but surprisingly fast network. It was like the mechanical ancestor of the modern internet. The air inside was heavy. Steam radiators would sometimes overheat the room excessively. If the window was opened, the freezing wind would enter. If it wasn't opened, tobacco smoke would sting the eyes. In those years, smoking in the office was common. Everyone from the manager to the intern had an ashtray on their desk. Towards the evening, a gray layer would form hanging from the ceiling. Female employees, especially secretaries, were the backbone of this chaotic order. The presence of women in business life was increasing rapidly in the 1920s. However, opportunities for advancement were still limited. While skyscrapers rose, invisible glass ceilings remained in place. A completely different scene was visible when, looking out the window, workers walking fearlessly on the steel skeleton of the neighboring building. The 1920s were the years when the sound of riveting was the city's anthem. Teams of 4 would catch red-hot nails in the air and fix them to the steel with giant pneumatic hammers. This rhythm would repeat all day long. The noise was not a disturbance but proof of progress. If the sound stopped, it meant growth had stopped too. The hierarchy within the office could be understood even from the heating. Corner offices meant not just a view but better functioning radiators. Those sitting in the middle of the corridor struggled with the cold air currents hitting their backs. Clerks would wear black armbands to protect their shirt sleeves. They would complete the day among ink stains, carbon papers, and eraser dust. As evening approached, shoulders would ache and fingertips would bear the mark of typewriter keys. But no one would slow down, because in this city, tempo was not a choice but a way of survival. When you stepped out of the office door back onto the street, steel, smoke, and wind would pull you back in, and you would still think this was just an ordinary workday. Yet you were actually walking right in the middle of one of history's fastest transformations. Those 8 hours past were actually silent proof of how modern industrial society was built. Time was no longer money but almost an obsession. Principles of scientific management had seeped into the offices. How many words you typed, how many calls you connected, how many files you organized were measured, recorded, and compared. Efficiency was the new virtue. Human relations were surprisingly formal. The titles Mr. and Miss were never missing. Jackets were not removed and ties were not loosened. Even if the world outside was shaken, order was maintained inside. The stock market could crash or a new prohibition could come into effect. But office discipline would not change. Composure was not a character trait but a professional necessity. When the clock struck noon, desks were tidied up and hats were taken. Because in New York City, lunch was not just about filling the stomach. It was a social showcase, a small stage. Queues formed again in front of the elevators. Everyone waited to go down. When stepping outside, the sharp cold of the morning would have softened a bit. But the air was still humid and heavy. However, in 1920, there was a small problem. Drinking alcohol outside was forbidden. Prohibition in the United States was in effect. Nevertheless, New Yorkers were extremely creative about bending the rules. At lunchtime, a strange activity would begin on the streets of Manhattan. Lawyers, bank clerks, civil servants. They all glided into side streets as if going on a secret mission. The target was usually a shop that looked ordinary from the outside. A tailor, a dry cleaner, or a small warehouse. But the smell of gin and tobacco rose from the basement. These were the famous speakeasies. As the name implies, it was necessary to speak in a low voice inside. Though it is debatable how much this rule was followed. Because these places were the loudest secrets of the city. A small ritual began when you reached the door. The sliding window would crack open and eyes scanning you would appear. Sometimes a password was asked. Sometimes they just looked at your clothes. A stylish coat and a proper hat were often enough. Once inside, the freezing winter outside was forgotten instantly. Dim light, warm air, and dense cigarette smoke, wooden panels, mirrors, crystal chandeliers. The band doubled the charm. Drinking was no longer just a habit but an elegant rebellion. Interestingly, the ban also normalized women entering bars. While a woman going to a bar alone before the ban was not welcomed. Since the speakeasy was already illegal, the old rules lost their power here. Seeing a young woman sitting at a table with a whiskey glass had become common. These places turned into early modern public spaces where social classes and gender roles mixed. Officially, the menus were innocent. Hot soups, sandwiches, stews. Operators had to be able to say, "We only serve food." But the real issue was the bootleg liquor poured into coffee cups. In that period, liquors known as bathtub gin were circulating. Made by mixing industrial alcohol with flavorings, its quality depended on luck. Sometimes it could even be dangerous. That is why people started mixing drinks with fruit juice and sugar to mask the taste. The foundations of the cocktail culture we know today actually lie in the effort to make this low-quality alcohol drinkable. Creativity was born somewhat out of necessity. Speakeasy employees acted almost like Secret Service agents. There would be a secret mechanism behind the bar for a possible raid. When a lever was pulled, the bottles would be hidden quickly. When the police entered, they would find only respectable citizens drinking soup and reading newspapers. Of course, the police often knew what was going on. But thanks to the wheel of bribery and mutual interest, raids usually remained for show. The city lived two lives. One was official, disciplined, and measured. The other was dim, smoky, and defiant. When the lunch break ended, everyone would straighten their coat again, put on their hat and return to the office. Serious expressions on faces, perhaps still a slight warmth of alcohol in pockets, and the typewriters would start talking again. It was a secret everyone knew, but no one spoke aloud, that even Jimmy Walker had a few favorite speakeasies at that time. When you stepped out of that dim basement and back onto the street after lunch, the ice-cold air hitting your face would bring you to your senses. The forbidden warmth and slight tipsiness inside would collide with the gray reality outside. Perhaps that was why New Yorkers wrapped themselves so tightly in their coats. Not just to protect themselves from the cold, but also to hide. The scent of that illicit pleasure lingering on them. In 1920, a lunch break meant escaping the rules of the world for a few hours. Now let's walk out of that dim atmosphere and into the glittering world of Fifth Avenue. Because in the afternoon, shop windows were not just for shopping, they were for dreaming. Walking on Fifth Avenue in the 1920s was not like wandering through a winter tale. It was like navigating through the gears of a giant marketing machine. Window shopping had turned into one of the greatest social activities of the modern city dweller, not just a casual pastime. Department stores turned their glass fronts into literal stages. Giants like Lord & Taylor and Macy's worked with artists for window designs. Even L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, wrote articles on window dressing. That glittering world behind the glass was not random. It was constructed to appeal to the subconscious. Even if the weather was below zero, people would stand in front of windows for minutes. Because what was on display was not just a coat or a dress. It was a new lifestyle. Vacuum cleaners, porcelain sets, exotic furs. All were presented as tangible proof of success. Powerful electric lights leaking from the stores reflected an artificial spring onto the faces of those walking the streets on a gray winter day. The first colored spotlights could transform even an ordinary product into a sacred object. The thin silk dresses on the mannequins behind the glass whispered to the shivering people with their collars turned up that another world was possible. And that whisper was powerful. Shopping habits had also changed. Things previously bought for need were now being bought for desire. Installment payment systems made items accessible to the middle class that were previously out of reach. The buy now, pay later mentality was taking root. The stores on Fifth Avenue were palaces of consumption. When you stepped inside, giant chandeliers, thick carpets, and extremely polite sales clerks made you feel not like a customer, but almost like an aristocrat. After the muddy and windy New York outside, this sterile and warm environment was a true sanctuary. Of course, the price of this sanctuary was the bill arriving at the end of the month. But the person of the 1920s was ready to sacrifice the anxiety of future payments for the excitement of today. The star of winter fashion was fur. Mink, fox, sable. A woman's social status was often measured by the fur she wore on her shoulders. But the ironic part was this. The straight-cut, light dresses of the 1920s were not suitable for winter at all. Women defied the cold with thin silk stockings and tried to find a balance with the heavy furs they wore over them. For men, the picture was more stable. Thick wool suits and fedora hats were still the standard. But their eyes, too, were on the lighter, sportier designs in the windows. Because the 1920s was a period where seriousness was slowly losing to speed and fun. The crowd in front of the windows reflected the class mix of the city. On one side, a wealthy woman leaving the store with her new fur. On the other side, An immigrant worker who could only look at the sparkle behind the glass from afar. On the same sidewalk, under the same wind, but with different dreams. The New York of the 1920s was a place where hope was commercialized. Everyone looking at those windows believed they could be on the other side one day. And perhaps the real energy keeping the city on its feet was not coal, steel, or money. It was exactly this belief that IT was no longer a secret to anyone, that even Mayor Jimmy Walker had a few favorite speakeasies. When you stepped out of one of those secret places after a meal, the ice-cold air hitting your face would bring you to your senses for a moment. The forbidden warmth, laughter, and slight daze of alcohol inside would collide with the gray, harsh reality of New York outside. The reason people wrapped themselves so tightly in their coats was not just the cold. That it was also to hide the scent of that illicit night. That in 1920s New York, disappearing for a few hours during lunch break meant suspending the world in dim corridors where the law could not reach. But every escape had a return. Now let's step out of that dark atmosphere and walk toward the lighted world of 5th Avenue. In the afternoon, Fifth Avenue was not just a place for shopping. It was a stage where a new life was being rehearsed. Walking there in the middle of winter was not like wandering in a fairy tale. That it was like moving through the gears of a giant marketing machine. Looking at windows was not an ordinary distraction. That it had turned into one of the most popular social rituals of modern city people. Stores designed the back of the glass almost like a theater stage. Giant names like Lord & Taylor and Macy's worked with artists for window arrangements. That it was even known that L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, wrote articles on window design for a period. In other words, the sparkle behind that glass was not random. It was planned to appeal to the human subconscious. While the weather outside was below zero, people would stand in front of the windows for minutes. What was exhibited was not just clothing but a way of life. Vacuum cleaners, porcelain sets, exotic furs, all were tangible symbols of success. Electric lights turned the dark winter afternoon into an artificial spring. They made even an ordinary coat look like a sacred object. While the mannequins behind the glass stood upright in summer silk dresses, the people walking on the sidewalk shivered with their collars turned up. This contrast summarized the spirit of the 1920s, the distance between reality and desire. The understanding of shopping had also changed. Formerly, people bought what they needed. Now they had started to buy what they wanted. With the spread of the installment sales system, the middle class could own more items than ever before. The idea of live first, pay later was slowly becoming normalized. These stores were designed like public palaces. Chandeliers, thick carpets, polite sales clerks. Everyone who entered felt like someone elite for a few hours. Muddy. And after the muddy and noisy streets, this sterile and warm environment was like a true sanctuary. Of course, the price of that sanctuary was the bill arriving at the end of the month. The star of winter fashion was real furs, mink, fox, sable. The fur on a woman would silently announce her social status. But the ironic side was this. The straight-cut, light dresses of the era were not suitable for winter at all. Women wandering in thin silk stockings tried to find a balance against the cold with heavy furs. Men were more constant. Thick wool suits and fedora hats were still the unchanging uniform. Still, the lighter, sportier designs in the windows caught everyone's attention. Because the 1920s was a period when seriousness began to leave its place to speed. The crowd in front of the windows also showed the class mix of the city. On one side, a wealthy woman leaving the store with her new fur. On the other side, an immigrant worker who could only look at the world behind the glass. But they both had one thing in common. The belief that the other side of that glass was possible. The windows did not only exhibit products. They illuminated the American dream for 24 hours. As you walked along the avenue, the thudding sound of shoes on the icy ground would echo. Even walking on Fifth Avenue was a performance in itself. People would scan each other, examine what everyone was wearing, and try to adapt to the rhythm of the city. The cold weather would accelerate this tempo. Greetings were short, steps were fast. The waves of warm air overflowing from store doors felt like a blanket draped over those walking for a few seconds. But a few blocks away from this glittering avenue, there was a completely different New York. Around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, the sidewalks experienced their busiest moments. While the heavy smell of coal soot hung in the air, a shrill voice would rise, "Extra! Extra!" These voices belonged to the newsboys. In the 1920s, the fastest way to learn what was happening in the world was the newspaper in their hands. Newspapers were printed not once a day but many times. Morning, noon, afternoon, night. A constantly turning wheel of paper and ink. These children knew by intuition which headline would sell more. They announced the most sensational news by shouting. If the stock market moved or a gangster was caught, their voices rose even higher. Since they bought the newspapers with cash, every copy they couldn't sell meant a slice of bread missing from their evening tables. Therefore, the sidewalk was a field of struggle not only against the cold but also against a brutal competition. The fight to capture a corner could sometimes be tougher than the stock wars on Wall Street. On the side, street vendors cooking things on their wheeled stalls were the natural heat sources of the sidewalks. Hot chestnuts, baked potatoes. As the steam rose, people would warm their hands for a few seconds and then continue on their way. Among them were those selling mechanical toys. Metal bears walking with clockwork, somersaulting monkeys. These simple toys coming from Germany were displayed like a small miracle in the middle of the sidewalk. The sellers were enthusiastic as if introducing the greatest invention in the world while explaining them. There were no price tags on the street. Bargaining was a ritual. Even the coldness of the weather could affect the price. If the wind blew hard, the seller would offer a discount to get rid of the goods. Because at that moment, what mattered was not profit, but returning to the stove as soon as possible. These people were the city's barometers. The expression on their faces told how long the winter would last. And there was a game of cat and mouse played with the police at every moment. Getting a license was difficult. Most sellers worked illegally. When a police officer was seen approaching with heavy steps from afar, the stall would be packed instantly. The sidewalk would empty within a few seconds. The lights of the avenue and this harsh reality a few streets away. New York of the 1920s lived exactly between these two worlds. Hope being sold on one side, the struggle for survival on the other. And what kept people on the street in that freezing winter was not just shopping or news. It was belief. The belief of being on the other side of the glass one day. When they saw the police from afar, those heavy stalls would close in seconds. The wheels would creak and blend into the crowd. The corner that was full of the smell of chestnuts just a moment ago would suddenly turn into an ordinary sidewalk. The New York police often ignored this game. Of course, if they were in a good mood that day or if there was no glitch in the invisible wheels. Order on the street did not run with written rules, but with a silent consensus. Everyone knew their role and the winter cold forced them to play these roles faster. Among the newsboys and street vendors, there were also shoe shiners. Winter was both a blessing and a torment for them. New York's famous gray mud ruined the leather shoes of elegant gentlemen in a few steps. The shiner would kneel down while his customer read the newspaper. He would try to clean the mud with ice-cold water. The sharp smell of the dye used added a chemical note to the smell of coal, tobacco, and moisture. People needed this service not just to make their shoes shine, but to protect the leather from snow and water. This was more a matter of defense than aesthetics. Towards 4 o'clock, the sidewalk would become even more crowded. Office workers approaching the end of their shift formed small clusters to buy the latest edition of the newspapers. New York of the 1920s was like a giant chessboard where everyone applied their own winter strategy that if you had a few cents in your pocket, you could buy hot chestnuts to warm your hands, that if you had a bit more money, you would browse the advertisements for the evening's theater. But if your pocket was empty, those same sidewalks felt like the longest and coldest road in the world, that a few neighborhoods beyond this open-air economy, there was a completely different world. The lights of Fifth Avenue did not reach there. Now let's turn our direction to those narrow streets where thousands of immigrants lived, to the tenement houses. The real pulse of the city was perhaps beating in those dim apartment voids. When you approached the door of a tenement building by crossing dirty snowdrifts, the first thing noticed was the smell. The concentrated state of the city, coal smoke, boiled cabbage, humidity, and hundreds of the cramped lives of humans formed a heavy layer in the corridors. Ventilation was often nothing more than a promise on paper. Most of these buildings were of the dumbbell type with narrow and dark centers. The design was supposedly for air circulation. In reality, those narrow gaps echoed the quarrels of neighbors and amplified the sound of trash thrown from above. When stepping through the door of an apartment, eyes would immediately fixate on one point: the cast iron coal stove in the kitchen. That stove was the cooker, the heater, and the hot water source all at once. For a poor family, coal was more precious than gold. That if the daily wage was not enough that day, the stove remained cold, and breaths hung in the air as clouds of steam while talking inside the room. For children, collecting pieces fallen from the coal truck was more than a game. A handful of coal meant an extra hour of warmth that night. This was a childish version of the survival reflex. The living space was so narrow that privacy was almost unknown. It was common for 7 or 8 people to sleep in one room. On winter nights, this crowd was actually an advantage. People tried to stay warm by huddling together and covering themselves with all the coats and wool blankets they could find. Bricks heated on the stove were wrapped in a cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. This method was simple but effective. If not wrapped carefully enough, it was no surprise to wake up in the morning with a small burn hole in the blanket. Hygiene was a separate test. Although the Tenement House Act of 1901 brought some improvements, in the winter of 1920, 2 or 3 families would still share a single toilet in the same corridor. Washing with cold water required courage. Most of the time, buckets of water were heated on the stove. While windows on the avenue were selling hope, people here were collecting coal crumbs for warmth. The same city, the same winter, but 2 completely different New Yorks. In most homes, hot water consisted only of a pot boiled on the stove. Therefore, taking a bath in winter was an organization in itself. Buckets were filled, water was heated, and turns were waited for. Most people went to neighborhood baths or public showers operated by the municipality once a week. The heavy smell felt on the street was not just from poverty, but from the near impossibility of staying clean in these freezing conditions. When looking at the windows, it would be noticed that the fire escapes were not empty. Those iron structures, which must be kept clear for safety today, functioned as an extra room, a pantry, or even a natural refrigerator in those years. Food was put in sacks and hung on the stairs so it wouldn't spoil. New York's sharp wind would freeze everything in a few minutes. But the risk was high. Hungry seagulls or a thief looking for an opportunity could make dinner disappear in an instant. A pot of food stolen from the fire escape was both the tragedy and the dark humor of these neighborhoods. There were usually simple but filling meals on the kitchen table: potatoes, onions, bread, and if the budget allowed, some cheap meat. Immigrants integrated their own culinary cultures into New York's limited resources with blended means. In Italian neighborhoods, the smell of tomato sauce spread through the corridors. In Jewish neighborhoods, the smell of salted meat and pickles prevailed. These meals did not only fill the stomach, they also kept one's spirits up. Every bite was a small victory won against the cold and uncertainty. The most ironic part of tenement life was this. While skyscrapers rose elsewhere in the city, life here resembled the physical struggle of centuries ago. On one side, the wealthy boasting about their vacuum cleaners. On the other side, women washing their laundry by hand and drying it on ropes stretched across the middle of the room. New York of the 1920s was widening the distance between these two extremes every day. But for those living in these buildings, what mattered was not economic indicators. It was being able to get through that winter without getting pneumonia. As the sun set, the weak light leaking from the windows and narrow streets gave the city a sad but resilient atmosphere. Behind every window there was a family trying to build a future in America. And when evening came, the atmosphere changed, especially in middle-class homes. It was time to gather around that mysterious wooden box standing in the middle of the living room. In the winter of 1920, owning a radio was a great source of pride. These devices were nothing like today's small radios. It was a marvel of technology made of polished wood, resembling a heavy piece of furniture with complex buttons on it. When you turned it on, sound wouldn't come immediately. One had to wait a few minutes for the vacuum tubes inside to heat up and glow with a dim orange light. This wait might be difficult for the impatient modern human. But in the 1920s, even this process itself was like preparation for a miracle. The year 1920 was the period when commercial radio broadcasts began in America. Until yesterday, frequencies where only amateur radio operators sent Morse codes were suddenly filled with music and news. While there was a snowstorm outside, being able to listen to an orchestra broadcasting from a hotel on the other side of the city at home felt like magic. The sound traveling kilometers with invisible waves to reach the room still sparked amazement. Radio was not an object left on in the background in those years. Family members brought their chairs closer and listened silently as if there were a live theater in front of them. The music rising through the crackling sounds or the deep voice of the announcer expanded the small apartment instantly. While the New York winter reigned outside, the sounds coming from inside that wooden box opened the door to another world for people. Listening to those crackling sounds rising from the radio exercised the imagination more than ever. The announcer saying, "We are now live from Broadway," would suddenly change the air of the small living room while snow drifted outside. Some would smile while looking at the radio box without realizing it, or even talk back to the announcer. In a short time, this wooden box had turned into the quietest but most talkative member of the house. Finding a station was a test of patience in itself. Radios in the early 1920s did not work with a single button. Usually, 3 separate dials had to be adjusted simultaneously and precisely. This pursuit, called dial hunting, became a hobby especially among men. Transformed that if the weather conditions were good, it was possible to catch broadcasts from Pittsburgh or Chicago and New York. Hearing the voice of a distant city through the static was almost like a discovery achievement at that time. Most of the time, the only thing heard was the rustle of the atmosphere, a sound that was both peaceful and exhausting of patience. The biggest rival of the radio inside the house was the piano in the corner. The Victorian tradition of making your own music was slowly weakening. While a young girl playing the piano was once considered a social necessity, it was now more attractive to listen to the country's best musicians with a single button. Although conservative circles saw this as laziness, no one intended to give up this convenience. Music now belonged to everyone who had a radio, not just the talented ones. The 1920s was the first decade when art truly became widespread. Moreover, the radio was like a little friend in winter. Vacuum tubes emitted heat while working and could increase the temperature of a small room by a few degrees. More importantly, it dispersed that famous loneliness of the New York winter. When snow blocked the roads and the wind made it impossible to go out, the cheerful voices from the radio reminded people that the world was still continuing to turn. The radio was not just a news source but a shield against isolation. As the night progressed, the tone of the broadcasts changed. The afternoon weather and stock market news were replaced by orchestras, poetry readings, and light entertainment programs. However, this technology was not cheap. A radio set could equal several months' salary of an average clerk. Therefore, many people tried to make their own devices. Simple receivers called crystal sets that worked without batteries were almost a craze among young people. A crystal stone, a wire coil, and headphones. The idea of catching invisible waves in the air was fascinating in itself. Connection with the outside world would be cut off while trying to catch that weak sound with headphones on, leaving the person alone with only the waves. This silent ceremony was actually an early rehearsal for the future world with television and the internet. People were participating in the atmosphere of a place where they were not physically present for the first time. This was a social experience that had not been lived much until that day. But New York was not a city lived only in the living room. Outside in the darkness, Broadway was still bright. That if you had a bit of courage and a thick coat, you could leave the warmth of the home and join that lighted world. You would immediately understand why it was called the Great White Way when you stepped into Times Square. Giant signs decorated with thousands of light bulbs turned night into day. Gum and automobile advertisements turned into a light show flickering under the snowflakes. Even if people pulled their shoulders up to their ears, they could not pass by without looking at this sight. Electricity was still a new miracle, and the gathering of so many lights gave the feeling that the future had already arrived. The heart of this lighted world was the massive cinema palaces. These structures, called movie palaces, were not just places where movies were watched. They were a spectacle in themselves. Marble stairs, gold-leafed ornaments, giant chandeliers. Someone entering would feel not like an ordinary viewer, but like a gala guest. While winter reigned outside, another reality began inside. The images flickering on the giant screen of silent cinema flowed, accompanied by the live music of the orchestra. Snow, cold, the smell of coal, all were forgotten for a few hours. Would you like me to? That was exactly what 1920s New York was. On one side, families listening to the radio by the stove. On the other side, crowds walking toward the future under the lights of Broadway. The cold was the same, but everyone was looking for their own warmth elsewhere. The cinemas of the 1920s should not be confused with today's halls. Those structures were not just entertainment venues. They were almost like royal palaces, with their capacities for thousands of people, massive crystal chandeliers, red velvet seats, and gold leaf wall ornaments. They made one feel as if they belonged to another class the moment they walked through the door. Stepping into cinemas like the Rialto or Rivoli meant not just watching a movie, but climbing the social ladder for a few hours. While New York's freezing winter reigned outside, that warm atmosphere heated by steam radiators was priceless. The uniformed attendants at the door greeted guests as if welcoming a state dignitary. Everyone who entered ceased to be an ordinary person, at least for that night. In 1920, movies were still silent, but the halls were never quiet. The images on the screen were accompanied by a giant orchestra or the famous mighty Wurlitzer pipe organ. The organist responded instantly to every movement on the stage, sharp chords for explosions, soft melodies for romantic scenes, accelerating rhythms for chases. Working in a cinema orchestra was a great prestige for musicians. If the conductor was in good form that day, even an ordinary film could turn into a masterpiece. On the screen were the stars of the era: Charlie Chaplin's clumsiness, Mary Pickford's innocence, Douglas Fairbanks' athletic heroism. Silent cinema acting was exaggerated, because emotions were explained with the body, not with the voice. Sadness was shown not only with tears but with arms raised to the sky. It might seem theatrical to today's viewer. But for the person of the 1920s, this was the purest expression of emotion. When the intertitles appeared, thousands of people squinted in the dim light. They laughed at the same time or sighed at the same time. Cinema was one of the rare places that could unite New York's complex population around a single emotion. There was another reality in the halls during winter. Everyone entering had heavy wool coats, wet hats, and muddy boots on them. As the hall warmed up, the smell of wet fabric mixed with popcorn and tobacco. A heavy but familiar air emerged. Still no one got up. Getting warm was a luxury in itself in that period. Some poor people bought the cheapest ticket and napped for a few hours in the back rows. The staff often ignored this, because everyone struggled with winter in their own way. That if the cinema was not attractive enough, there were the live theaters and musicals of Broadway. The 1920s was the peak period of the Ziegfeld Follies. The giant decors on the stage, synchronized dancers, and glittering costumes made one forget the gray reality outside. In the backstage, there was a completely different picture. In narrow rooms where heating was insufficient, actors wrapped themselves in their coats and waited for their turn. But when the stage lights turned on, they put on smiles that glowed as if they had never been cold. They enchanted the audience. Professionalism was the strongest shield against the cold. Productions on Broadway also reflected the changing moral understanding of society. The freedom of women on stage, shorter skirts, and bolder jokes disturbed conservatives. But box office numbers were rising. In the era of prohibitions, having fun was a silent resistance for many. The ice-cold air hitting your face when you left the theater would suddenly return you to reality. But the melody of the orchestra would still be in your ears, and the glow of the stage lights in your eyes. Towards midnight, the crowd in Times Square would slowly dissolve. However, this did not mean the city was sleeping. In 1920, the night was just the closing of one act of entertainment. People would leave the fairy tale world of cinema and theater and turn toward other adventures. Now let's leave those velvet curtains behind and walk toward the giant white void in the middle of the city. To Central Park. It turned into crystal chandeliers. As the crowd on the ice rinks slowly thinned out, the laughter coming from afar and sharp rustle of skate blades on the ice would be the background music of the night. But this fairy tale scene in Central Park would not last long. Because in 1920s New York, the night never consisted of just one scene. The crowd leaving the park would split in two. One part would walk toward their homes, toward warm apartment flats. The other part would head toward the places where the city's real pulse beat. Those secret doors that were officially forbidden but known by everyone in reality. Places hidden in basements with curtains tightly drawn, that could not be entered without a password at the door. What greeted you when you stepped inside was not snow, but the smell of sweat and tobacco. This was where jazz reigned. The small group on stage would split the night in two with the metallic scream of the trumpet. The rhythm of the drum would accelerate like a heartbeat. The double bass kept a deep pulse in the dark. Young people with their hats slightly tilted on one side. Women in fur coats on the other side. Everyone was a bit bolder under the shadow of prohibitions. There was a prohibition on alcohol, but the glasses were not empty. For a New Yorker, a winter night was an endurance test. Resisting the cold, continuing to have fun, suppressing the harshness of life with laughter. This was the spirit of the 1920s. When midnight had long passed, the lights of Times Square were still on. The snow turned pink and blue under the neon signs. As the streets slowly became quiet, the city actually never slept. Because in 1920s New York, winter was not a season, it was a character. The cold was harsh, but life was harsher. People either got cold and pulled aside or chose to dance right in the middle of the cold. And if you were a resident of this city at that time, You knew one thing very well, that it could snow, it could freeze, the wind could cut your face. But New York would never slow down. Tells about developments. The mother mentions saving tips she read in the newspaper. Children excitedly interject with things they learned at school. The light from the single bulb on the table frames everyone's face in yellowish. The cold leaking from behind the window leaves thin ice flowers on the glass. While winter reigns outside, another world is established inside. When the radio is turned on, the air of the room changes. A crackling announcer's voice, jazz melodies, or political news from the capital. They all come out of that small wooden box and sit in the middle of the table. In 1920s New York, the radio was seen not just as an entertainment tool, but as the voice of modernity. For families, this meant connecting to the world and staying in the warmth of the home at the same time. As the meal progresses, the plates get heavier. The last pieces of meat stripped from the bones are taken. Sauces are wiped with bread. Then that famous jelly comes to the table, trembling, that shiny surface swaying slightly every time the spoon dips, was almost an edible symbol of the era's admiration for technology. It was fun for children and the taste of progress for adults. But not every home had the same abundance. In the lower-income neighborhoods of the city, tables were set more simply. Less meat, more bread, fewer varieties, more sharing. Still, the logic was the same. Calories were essential to resist the cold. Winter was not as gentle as it appeared in romantic postcards. Heating was expensive, coal was limited, and every bite was actually a kind of fuel. When the meal ended, the plates were collected. While the sounds of dishes came from the kitchen, the house slowly switched to night mode. Coats dried behind the door. The snow under the boots melted and formed small puddles. The city was still howling outside, but the world inside had calmed down. In 1920s New York, winter was not only experienced on the street. It was completed in the velvet seats of cinema halls, on the frozen lakes of Central Park, in the smoky rooms of jazz clubs, and finally around the kitchen table. The day started with laughter on the ice and ended with the steam of hot soup. And perhaps that's why, for the people of that period, winter was not just a season to be endured, but an experience to be shared. The cold was harsh, the city was ruthless, but when sitting at the table, everyone felt the same truth. Even if the heart of New York froze outside, it always managed to stay warm somewhere inside. They stood right in the middle of the dance floor. As the Charleston steps accelerated, their fringed dresses caught the light. With every turn, a small challenge was thrown at the rules. They were not just dancing, they were declaring the changing moral understanding of the 1920s with their bodies. This female figure who smoked, laughed loudly, and did not wait for permission to take a man's arm was an open objection to the habits of the old world. Therefore, they were an admiration for some and a threat for others. The men sitting at the tables were no different. Bankers, journalists, dock workers. These people who looked serious with ties during the day turned into ordinary regulars of the forbidden world at night. Because the alcohol prohibition existed in theory, but in practice, the city flowed from underground. The cocktails served at the bar looked colorful, but no one questioned too much where the alcohol inside came from. Hard liquors made in bathtubs were softened with fruit juices and syrups, mixed almost like a chemical balance experiment. Many cocktails considered classics today were the legacy of that era's effort to hide defects. The atmosphere of the place would thicken. Tobacco smoke stuck to the ceiling. The smell of sweat and perfume mixed together. The trumpet would rise. The piano would answer. The drum would speed up the tempo. At the center of the music were often black musicians coming from Harlem. These artists who faced discrimination in official life were the real names keeping the pulse of the city at night. Social boundaries became blurred while on stage. The rhythm was common for everyone. But this sense of freedom was always fragile. The attendant standing by the door looked out from time to time. Every heavy footstep coming from the street created a moment of silence. The possibility of a police raid was the invisible guest of the night. Lights going out suddenly, glasses being hidden, the music being cut. These were scenarios no one was a stranger to. Still, people continued to come. Because in 1920s New York, the prohibition did not decrease the charm. On the contrary, it increased it, descending from the cold streets to that warm and vibrating basement was not just about having fun. It was about playing a small game with the system. As the night progressed, the snow outside continued to fall silently. There was a sharp contrast between the laughter inside and the wind outside. On one side, a disciplined, conservative daytime city. On the other side, a night world that bent the rules. And perhaps this was exactly what made the winter of 1920 so unforgettable. The same city, the same people. But two different lives. Those who skated on the ice in Central Park during the day and sat at the family table in the evening could get caught up in the rhythm of jazz and raise a forbidden glass when night came. In the cold New York night, the collars of the coats were rising again. Hats were being lowered over the eyes and doors were closing softly. The music stayed inside. But that rhythm continued to beat inside people. Because living in New York in the winter of 1920 meant learning to go back and forth between frozen streets and boiling basements. The moonlight leaking from the edge of the window draws a pale rectangle on the wall of the room. The slight swaying of the curtain reminds that the wind outside is still on duty. But you have already set up your trench. The radiator hisses occasionally. The steam passing through the pipes makes small expansion sounds in the metal. These sounds are like a lullaby in 1920s New York. A taxi passing far from the street. Perhaps the footsteps of the watchman on the corner. The city does not completely fall silent. It only lowers its voice. While the weight of the quilt settles on your shoulders, the layers of the day slowly slide off you. The morning frost, the crunch of the ice in Central Park, the steam of the dinner, the sharp cry of the trumpet in the jazz club. They all mix together. A winter day is long and intense. Night is the time to digest it. A slight cough from the neighboring apartment or the creaking of a floorboard upstairs reminds you that you are not actually alone in this giant city. Apartment life in the 1920s walks a thin line between privacy and crowds. The walls are thin but life is shared. As the hot water bottle placed inside the bed slowly spreads its heat, your toes thaw out. Nightcap on your head, wool underwear on. It may not look romantic but it is practical. Because the New York winter is unforgiving. You have to go to work in the morning, catch the tram and continue with life. Getting cold is not a luxury. As your eyes get heavy, the wind outside wanders around the corners of the building. Manhattan skyscrapers are still standing in the moonlight. On the harbor side, ship whistles blend into the night. The city is like a giant machine, but you are now a small warm cell inside that machine. For a New Yorker in the winter of 1920, sleep is not just resting. It is recharging. Because the next day will be cold again. It will freeze again and prohibitions and opportunities will walk side by side again. The last thought under the quilt is usually the same. I survived today. I didn't get cold. I had fun. I ate. I laughed. And as the snow continues to fall outside, New York takes a breath for a moment. When morning comes, everything will start all over again. While the ice flowers on the windows continue to shine like silver in the moonlight, your mind slowly moves away from that dizzying speed of the day. What you saw during the day passes like a film strip, the shining windows of 5th Avenue, the vibrating rhythm of the underground jazz club, the silence of Central Park buried in white. New York of the 1920s made everyone feel like they were right in the middle of a big stage. But when it's time for sleep, that stage darkens. The richest banker and the boy selling newspapers in the morning take refuge in the same darkness. The bed is the only place that suspends class differences, because life ringing at 5 in the morning does not favor anyone. There is no luxury of saying, "I'm not a morning person." New York either wakes you up on time or leaves you behind. After midnight, the street falls almost completely silent. The footsteps of a passing police patrol now and then, or the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages preparing for morning milk delivery. The city is as if it has taken a deep breath and is holding it.in 1920. The night is not as bright and noisy as today. A few street lamps light the corners. The side streets are surrendered to the darkness. This darkness is not scary, it is restful. Because when morning comes, steel and concrete will climb to the sky again. Factories will work, typewriters will clatter, jazz will rise again. But now, while the snowflakes glide down slowly, the city allows itself to stop. The slight hardness of the pillow, the reassuring weight of the wool blanket. The radiator has long since fallen silent, but the warm air accumulated in the room throughout the day is still felt. When you close your eyes, that gray and freezing winter now turns only into a memory. You are a small but indispensable part of this massive transformation. The horn sounds, typewriter clatters, and jazz melodies in your mind slowly fade away. The lights of Broadway go out, the doors of the underground clubs are locked, the frozen lakes of Central Park are left alone under the moonlight. And you, under the heavy quilt, glide into the smoky but hopeful dreams of 100 years ago. Even New York gets tired at this hour. Even New York sleeps at this hour. Outside, the snow continues to fall, sounds drift away, lights dim, the night surrounds you. Completely, the city is sleeping, you sleep too. Good night, peaceful dreams.